Morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Jennifer Turner. I'd like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jennifer Turner, as my big sign tells you. I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. I've been here 23 years. And across all my time here at the Wilson Center, climate change has been a big focus of our work on U.S.-China relations. We've looked at different kinds of infrastructure cooperation and competition between the two, and the energy transport. We have a new project starting soon on food and climate, greenhouse gas emissions in the two countries. And today we're kind of taking a step back and getting a broader look, looking at global green infrastructure. So today's meeting is called Race to the Top on Global Green Infrastructure from BRI to Bluedot and Beyond. So late in the summer, there was heat waves that spread across the globe. China had the worst heat wave in recorded human history. So Mother Earth shooting yet another shot over the bow that climate change is real, and that maybe that countries need to move faster to get more low carbon infrastructure online, get rid of the high carbon to help us meet and surpass the Paris climate commitments and UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of movement these days, different kinds of mechanisms for green infrastructure systems coming out. And today, at this webinar, I have four fabulous people who are going to help us kind of sort out this increasingly busy landscape of global green infrastructure initiatives. So we're just going to jump right into it. So I'm going to have intros quick in the order that they will speak. They're going to talk for about 8 minutes each. Elizabeth Losos is a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. She's going to start off talking about an overview of the obstacles to private investment into green infrastructure, and also give us a little better understanding of this boom in new standards and monitoring systems to ensure the quality of green infrastructure projects that are going to be built. And then coming to us live from a quarantine hotel in Shanghai, China, we have Christoph Nedopil Wang. He's the founding director of the Green Finance and Development Center in Shanghai. Soon you'll be home, I'm sure. He's going to talk about the promise of China's green light system. And this system is meant to better assess the sustainability of China's Belt and Road projects. Eager to hear about this. I love the name, by the way, Green Light. And then we've got third on the docket, we have Carmel Lev, who's a program officer at the Global Infrastructure Facility. She will talk about FAST-Infra. It's a public-private initiative led by the HSBC and the World Bank that's brought together more than 50 organizations to mobilize private financing for sustainable infrastructure. Finally, our closing pitcher. Baseball season's almost over, so I have to kind of throw that in one last time. We have Peter Thorin. He's a senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. He's going to lay out the potential of the Bluedot network. It's yet another global infrastructure initiative developed by the governments of the US, Australia, and Japan, and endorsed by the G7. So, and there's even more than those, I'm sure that they'll come up, but these are the main three we'll talk about. But Elizabeth, I pass the virtual mic to you. And remind the audience, if you look underneath the screen, there is a widget. You can start anytime. I think you can only do it once every 10 minutes. So question, you can start now and you can get a bunch in by the time the Q&A opens. Please say your affiliation so we know who we're talking to. All right, Elizabeth, now I will mute. And if you could share your screen, that would be great.
Thank you, Jennifer. And hold on just a moment. Oops.
I'm seeing it. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Just get to the top and we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Oops. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, good.
Good?
It's good.
Great. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I am going to sort of give the overview and launch these three initiatives that you are talking about. We are talking today about an infrastructure gap, particularly in low and lower middle income countries. By some estimates, there will be more than $40 trillion US dollars of infrastructure need in developing countries by 2035. But it's not just the quantity of money that is the problem, it's also the quality. There's a long history of large infrastructure projects not necessarily fully addressing the needs of countries and sometimes actually exacerbating problems. So it's not that we need just more money. We needed the right money. We need to be able to build green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, quality infrastructure. And the good news is we know how to do that. There are actually, over the last decade plus, a dizzying array of different protocols, guidance, guidelines, principles, etc., that help us figure out how to build green, sustainable, and quality infrastructure. And so that's the good news, but the bad news is that this array of different tools, etc., is actually confusing. And so if you are a country looking for, say, sustainable infrastructure, it's hard to know what that means and how you find it. If you are a developer and you want to get into that market, knowing exactly which rating system or which tool to use or what principles to follow, it is complicated, and it actually is a barrier. And in particular, the private sector, Jennifer, which you brought up, is actually put off by their inability to feel comfortable, confident in knowing where to invest, feeling that the environmental, social, governance, and financial risks are such that they can comfortably, particularly invest in developing countries. And so what happens is there are literally trillions of dollars available in institutional funds like pension funds that have an ESG mandate. That means environment, social governance mandate. And this is a big growing market, but a lot of this money is sitting on the sidelines when it comes to infrastructure in developing countries because they aren't confident, they don't want to take the risk. And so that is really an acknowledged problem that has been addressed by 3 initiatives that we're going to hear from today. This need for essentially a simple means of knowing what is green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, quality infrastructure, something that one can easily and confidently rely on, both for environmental, social, governance, but also financial risks. And so there are these 3 initiatives that all got started a few years ago and are in the middle of really still early in the rollout. I think you mentioned the 3 already, so I won't go through them, but each has developed what I call a meta standard. And that is, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot out there already. Each one of these has gone ahead and mapped out all those different tools and principles and tried to come up with a simple means of identifying what would be a meta standard, which would help you identify a infrastructure project that you could feel confident in investing in. So I'm going to leave the details to the next speakers, but I'm going to give a couple of quick overviews to help you sort of, as each of you listen to the speakers, understand how they compare to each other. So when thinking about what is green, sustainable, quality infrastructure, the G20 several years ago developed something called the Quality QII Principles, or Quality Infrastructure Investment Principles, and they have these 6 different pillars. And so the first, the Green Development Guidance, which is essentially the green traffic light that you mentioned earlier, Jennifer mentioned, is part of this Green Development Guidance that the Belt and Road BRIGC has come up with, that really focuses on the environmental considerations. It is climate change, biodiversity conservation, and pollution control is their main focus. Then FAST-Infra is focused more on what we traditionally think of as the ESG components, environment, similar to the Green Development Guidance, but also adding in other environmental impacts, social things like labor rights, etc., governance, debt sustainability is an important issue, and adaptation and resilience. And then finally, Bluedot network really maps onto the whole QII principles, adding in economic efficiency, financial efficiency, and sustainable development and growth. And so when I talked earlier about green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, and quality, they more or less would map onto these three different levels of scope. So the other broad comparison I want to make is who they're targeting. And all of these initiatives, all of the meta standards really have to focus on all three of these groups: the host country sponsors, the enterprises that are going to build the projects, and then the financial institutions that will fund them. And in all cases, they're going to, they've been trying to coordinate with all three, but really the enterprises is a particular focus, and even more so, all three are especially focused on the financial institutions. These meta standards are really foremost developed with that in mind, and even within that, there are different types of financial institutions: bilateral, multilateral, and private sector. And just to help sort of understand where each of these are, the green development guidance is, and all of these meta standards are voluntary. So they're focusing green development guidance on the Chinese government, essentially, and all the state-owned, whether financial institutions, regulatory institutions, or the state-owned enterprises. FAST-Infra is very much focused on the private sector, but also multilateral development banks and other multilateral institutions. And Bluedot, again, on the private sector, but really private sector and bilateral. So this is an important point. Both Bluedot and FAST-Infra fundamentally are about trying to get all of that private sector funding that's sitting on the sidelines, make it comfortable for them to enter the market. And in the case of Bluedot, it is really directly linked back to this G7 initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, where there is a commitment of $600 billion over the next 5 years or so for infrastructure investments. And that will depend on really private sector funding, because these countries are not taking this out of their own coffers, they're expecting. And so these standards are critical for the success of that. So I'm just going to end with 3 questions that I will be looking at as we hear, and maybe we can talk about this further. The first is, ultimately, these meta standards are great, but they need to be adopted. And what indication do we have that they actually will be successful being adopted by all 3 of those different groups of stakeholders? The second is, it is all 3 of them fundamentally are trying to clarify this wide array of guidance and tools, et cetera. But will the 3 different meta standards and any others that come about right now end up competing with each other and further confusing the market, or can they be coordinated in a way that they reinforce and sort of raise the call, the race to the top that Jennifer's talking? And finally, when you think of those 3 stakeholders, it's the host government that have had the least attention to date, in my opinion. And so there is this critical question: will these standards be seen by the receiving governments as helping them attract the type of investments they're looking for, or will they be seen as a barrier to yet one more barrier to getting international investments? And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to the next speaker so we can hear more details.
Thank you so much. I already feel like you've helped sort out some of that space a bit. If you can unshare your screen, Elizabeth, then we can have Christoph can leap in as well. And we will come back to those questions you put in the Q&A. Christoph, it's you.
Thank you so much. Let me, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, for being here. It's really great, such a great event. It's always a pleasure also to speak after Elizabeth. That's very difficult. She already laid out such a beautiful lay of the land of the infrastructure, financing, and standard landscape. I will try my best to highlight some of the things that we do with the green development guidance. So here's kind of the title, and there's some Chinese, of course, in there as well. So I'm sitting here indeed in Shanghai in a quarantine hotel. And so if there's some noise in the background, please excuse that. Also a big shout out to all of the audience today. I think some of them I know well. So glad that you are here. Very warm welcome. Let me first share kind of with you kind of the size and scope of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is, of course, it is indeed the largest infrastructure investment program that has been ongoing for the last 9 years, since 2013, and since it was coined Belt and Road Initiative. And over the last 9 years, we had about $932 billion of engagement from China in the Belt and Road Initiative countries, most of it through construction contracts, so a lot of loans, and some of $371 billion in non-financial investments. So these are really big investments that China has been doing, and particularly, of course, in the energy and transportation sector. So it's two of the core sectors of infrastructure that have both positive development aspects, but of course also very negative environmental impacts if not done properly. What's interesting that since 2020, so even before the official announcement of President Xi to not build Chinese coal-fired power plants abroad, we don't see coal investments since 2020. So that was, I think, a really big ask from the international community, and that was achieved in 2020. And the great thing is actually the Green Development Guidance played a massive role in phasing out coal for China. So what is the Green Development Guidance, the traffic light system? And unfortunately, being in China, the traffic light system, the Green Development Guidance, the green light system, Jennifer, as you called it, it's all the same thing. It's all related. It's all kind of different though. So the overall kind of publication is called the Green Development Guidance. The Green Development Guidance has a traffic light system, which is one of the core elements of the Green Development Guidance. Now, the Green Development Guidance, I was privy to be the lead author of the Green Development Guidance in 2020 when we published it, and also 2021 the application guide. And now we're working on some more stuff that is coming out. So stay tuned for that. So that it's a very live and kicking project. Also, to understand, the BRI, who publishes the Green Development Guidance, is a government-supported international coalition. It is under the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and has very strong support from all of the relevant ministries. And it's tasked by the president to look at how can we green the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Green Development Guidance kind of has these 9 recommendations that are very much aligned with the international standards to really focus on all project phases, have an exclusion list, do environmental impact assessment that is ideally based on international standards, and so on and so on. So these 9 recommendations have been adopted from international standards very much to the Chinese context and lifted very much the Chinese overseas project finance. And the traffic light system, I think, is something that was very innovative. Also, we have not seen anything so far in this regard, kind of to really categorize projects into red, yellow, and green projects. And so all of the projects that have any type of environmental harm, whether it's biodiversity, climate, or pollution, would be labeled as red. So there was kind of a big discussion, big philosophical discussion. How do we actually make this traffic light system work? And so even if you're great in climate, but really bad in other biodiversity aspects, you will still be labeled as red. And that should ideally have consequences. And I think what's also interesting that we launched in December 2020, so way before some of the other guidelines and FAST-Infra. So it was in many ways, China took a leadership position in designing an overseas investment guide, particularly with government involvement. So it's still today the only government-issued overseas investment guide like this. I want to highlight 6 innovations that the Green Development Guidance has. Number one is really kind of to integrate all 3 environmental dimensions. You think that it's now kind of standard. It was not standard in 2020, and in many ways, it's still in practice not fully standard to really focus fully on biodiversity. It's so much focus on climate, also in the World Bank standards, much more focus on climate. Biodiversity is a side topic, unfortunately, still. The Green Development Guidance has biodiversity as a core of the decision criteria. The integration of local considerations, which was extremely important for the Chinese stakeholders to say, the Belt and Road Initiative has a lot of different countries. How can we make sure that we're not telling other countries what they should do, but that we can adopt our kind of rigid traffic light system to the local context? And so we developed this 2-stage evaluation process that has sector characteristics. So for example, hydropower is a sector, but then it's the question, how do you implement it for mitigation and compensation? So hydropower itself is a green energy for many, but actually it has massive biodiversity impacts. So if it's implemented really badly, it is a red project, but if it's implemented very well, then it can be a red-green project. So this 2-stage process was extremely important and is still innovative to today. Applicable to all types of projects. We formed a taxonomy of 36 projects in the first stage, but it can be relevant and can be applied for all other projects. So that's in the application guide. Integration of all BRI stakeholders, and that's important. So this is not a guideline for the international community as much as it is for the Chinese community, Chinese financial institutions, Chinese developers and regulators, and the local communities on the ground. It is aligned with the international standards in order to do co-financing, but it's nevertheless targeted at the Chinese stakeholders. Differentiated management, that means red projects, kind of the harmful projects, get worse conditions than the green projects. And then impacting actually current policy, and I will talk about this in a second. This took us very long kind of to agree on this evaluation process. So this is a 2-stage evaluation process that looks in the first stage at the project characteristics to come up with green, yellow, and red categorization. And then in the second phase on how do you actually implement it? What are the management processes? If you have a bad project and you implement it bad, it stays red. But if you are actually moving into a environmental benefit space and compensate for all of the environmental harm, you can become a red-green project. And here, the differentiated management, I think that's also very important, and this is becoming much more applied now in terms of what are the responsibilities for the financial institutions and for financing, give worse financing to red projects, better financing for green projects. For the insurance company, the same thing. So Cynosure actually has supported a traffic light system to some extent. And also in environmental reporting. Right now, in all of the green finance world, we unfortunately go this track that if you want to be green, you have to report much harder. So it's kind of a disincentive to be green. We have to move the other way. If you are red, if you are harmful, then you actually should have stricter criteria. And so this is one of the suggestions that we also made in the application guide. And what I want to highlight here is that the traffic light system and the BRI Green Development Guidelines actually have been applied in Chinese government guidelines. So what you see is in this graph kind of all of the relevant BRI overseas financing guidelines that came out from the different Chinese ministries, State Council, NDRC, Ministry of Commerce, and so on. And all of the red dots mean that the guidelines said we are green, but you can do whatever is appropriate in the host country. So the host country principle. And the host country principle is in many of the BRI countries very low. The environmental standards are really bad. So if you say you can do whatever is allowed in the host country, of course, it means nothing. And so since 2020, since we developed with the MEE together the traffic light system, the green development guidance, since then we were able to push all of the guidelines and regulation to say apply international standards for environment when you do overseas investments, and that has trickled down for the developers, so for which the MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce, and MEE is responsible, as well as to the financial institutions for which the CDRC on the lower side is responsible. So that is really a massive change that has taken place since 2020. And with that, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I assume that I mean, this publication is online, because I know that people might want to dig into your multiple dotted pictures. All right, so how about we have Carmel, why don't you bring up your slides and we can continue the conversation.
Sounds
And
great.
just reminding the audience that I've got some questions are coming in, so please keep bringing in the questions, because the Q&A will start after these next two speakers. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jennifer. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Excellent.
It looks great.
Perfect. Great. So I'll just quickly overview the FAST-Infra Sustainable Infrastructure label, and can certainly leave some time for questions at the end. So this is meant to provide a little bit of an overview of what it is, but also where we've been and where we're going. So getting started. Excellent. So as Jennifer alluded to just at the very beginning, FAST-Infra is a broad global initiative that came out of French President Emmanuel Macron's One Planet Lab. And so it encompasses various work streams. As you can see here, the founding members of FAST-Infra include the Global Infrastructure Facility, which is where I sit, alongside HSBC, IFC, OECD, and the Climate Policy Initiative. And it's really this multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together members of the private sector, governments, multilaterals, and DFIs, rating agencies, and civil society. So it's meant to encompass the collective efforts of these various players in the ecosystem. And the overarching goal of FAST-Infra is to really promote infrastructure as a deep and liquid asset class. So the Sustainable Infrastructure label is one of the flagship initiatives as part of this broader effort. So here, the overall kind of intent of this label is, to Elizabeth's point, is not to reinvent the wheel, but really create a globally applicable standard for sustainability as it relates to infrastructure that really encompasses best practice and guidance that's already out there. So, and we're looking both at kind of the upstream and downstream elements of an infrastructure project. So most upstream, the benefits of the label are really to help, governments and MDBs who are helping governments to design and prepare projects that have sustainability already built into the project from the very beginning, and kind of moving through the PPP process. But further downstream, the label and having the application to the asset itself is meant to create a very powerful market signal that the project itself is sustainable and quite rigorously reviewed as such. And, we're seeing already increased appetite from the private sector to align investment decisions around ESG. So this is meant to kind of provide that, essentially that quality stamp of approval that the asset itself is sustainable, considering the environmental, social, governance, and adaptation resilience aspects of the project. And it's really meant to provide a sense of market assurance. The label is also meant to facilitate due diligence, providing good market guidance and kind of good methods and indicators for measuring sustainability. And as part of the initial mapping process of the label, which already took into consideration over 25 existing standards, taxonomies, and frameworks, it's also built on the IFC performance standards, is mapped to the G20 QII principles, takes into consideration the EU taxonomy, SFDR, TCFD, all of the acronyms that you can think of we've looked at. So going into the label itself, and just to give you a bit of an overview, again, the label is meant to provide coherency in the ecosystem regarding the quality and sustainability of the asset. And the framework itself encompasses, essentially takes all of the mapping that we did and distills it into 14 sustainability criteria that make up our baseline. And the baseline itself builds on the IFC performance standards and includes a few additional features as well. And we have, and the 14 criteria are kind of split across these 4 dimensions of environmental, social, governance, adaptation, and resilience. In addition to the 14 criteria, there is an associated set of what we're calling positive contribution factors. And so it's defined as something that is above and beyond the baseline. And in order to self-declare as being SI label compliant, not only do you need to meet all 14 of the baseline criteria, but at least one of the positive contribution factors. And that will depend likely on the project itself, because we understand that not all projects, depending on the project, it might be better suited towards meeting, let's say, one of the criteria, the positive contribution factors on the S versus the G. A key point about the SI label is that it is meant to not just provide consistency, but transparency in terms of how it's reported and disclosed. Something that I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation is that public and transparent disclosure is really key to the label and meant to kind of prevent any sort of tendency for greenwashing. Any asset that goes through the self-declaration process must disclose how they meet the criteria and provide a relevant rationale for that. And then finally, governance will be a key part of ensuring that there's continuity and kind of growth of this label over time. So I'll talk a little bit later about the secretariat that we're putting in place to actually administer this label over time. And I've sent Jennifer the link to the landing page, made a reference here at the bottom, but all of these documents in terms of the framework, the criteria, and proposed vision for governance of the label can be found on the public landing page, and this was announced at COP26 last year. Okay, so now where are we going from here? So what we've been doing since launching the label last November is actually trying to pilot test this label on a few projects. So we've done this with one gift-supported project alongside IFC and the World Bank, but you can see that we're really trying to work with both multilaterals and the private sector in proposing some projects that are either in the kind of early stage or operational to actually see how the criteria works in practice. So we've been working with 3 independent verifiers on a kind of pro bono basis to start testing this out, so we can develop some good community of practice of case studies that we can have publicly available of how they have met or fallen short of fully meeting the criteria, to see what lessons learned we can get from there. And the kind of guidance document that one of our verifiers, Mazars, has produced will be included on our website as well. Additionally, we have registered FAST-Infra group as a legal entity. So this is the group that will essentially help to oversee the various FAST-Infra initiatives, including the SI label separately, but in parallel, we have also identified the consortium that will serve as a secretariat for the label that will be announced at COP27 in a few weeks. And the secretariat will be kind of very similar, I'd say, in scope and structure of, let's say, ICMA as it relates to the green bond principles, but is really meant to ensure that the SI label is a living document that is constantly reflective of market dynamics, new standards, ensuring that it's really kind of moving with the market here. And it will have a data reporting repository component again. So this goes back to the transparent disclosure. There will be essentially a public repository where all projects that are SI label declared will be featured there. And hopefully over time, as more projects are declared, it can be used as a form of analysis of various projects across different sectors and be used as actually a very useful tool. And yeah, so COP27 will really serve as this moment to not just drum up more endorsement and kind of launch the label yet again in its new form, but to continue moving from this endorsement to actual application. Again, these pilot projects are just the first step, but we're already seeing a lot of partners who have been with us on the journey for FAST-Infra start to use this as well. Not just within the GIF, where we're going to be working with our MDB technical partners to incorporate the SI label into the projects that we're supporting. But HSBC and Temasek have jointly developed a sustainable infrastructure portfolio fund where the SI label will be a key kind of requirement for projects that are funded through that mechanism. Same with Pentagreen Capital based in Singapore, also making calls to actually start to use the label in practice. So we're hoping to see more examples of this over time and start to move towards that implementation stage. So here's the website for more information. Jennifer can drop that in the chat as well, and happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Carmel. It sounds like you guys are starting to get some critical mass going. I love it. Peter, could you start bringing up your PowerPoint? And I am getting more questions coming in on the widget underneath the streaming screen. So please toss them in there. And then, yeah, we'll just keep.
How does that look?
If you can make it, enlarge it so it fills the screen, or presentation mode at the play from the start, the little button on the left. There we go.
Is that right?
Oh, no, just hit play from start.
Right.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Full screen now. Okay.
It is full screen now. Thank you. And
Great.
a pretty picture.
All right. Thanks on Jennifer. I do have a short PowerPoint here. I'll just use to have some graphics up here. So I think many people watching this event today are going to have at least a passing familiarity with the Bluedot network and their goals, but I'll refresh your memories on what BDN is, as we call it, why we're doing it, and how it works, and where we're headed to from here. Let's see. So here's a quick Bluedot network refresher here. So as you can see, this is an initiative that we're implementing together with our partners, Australia and Japan. Similar to the other initiatives we're talking about today, the intention of BDN is to certify infrastructure projects that have demonstrated that they've upheld widely recognized global standards. We'd like Bluedot network certification to be a global symbol of quality infrastructure development. So if you see a blue dot on a new bridge, you know that the whole design and development followed strong standards and international best practices. And the idea behind the Bluedot network is that by demonstrating that projects have met global standards, we can help de-risk those projects, not all the way, obviously, but to a point where investors are willing to come off the fence and invest some of what's estimated at about $100 trillion in funds that are managed by private sector institutions. So from a development perspective, like everyone else, we're looking to mobilize more financing, of course, and also help build better quality infrastructure, but it goes beyond that too. We also want to encourage better governance, better attention to infrastructure's effects on the environment, the climate, communities, and better consideration for future generations who would be the ones who are going to be paying off the debt from any poorly designed projects. So how will BDN work? We're working with the OECD on putting this all together. The OECD has been providing technical support and expertise on BDN, working on a certification methodology and an assessment framework for just how BDN will certify an infrastructure project. They came out with a report earlier this year, and you can find it on their website, which can go into much more detail than I'll go into here today. So one thing to be clear on at the start is that Bluedot Network isn't creating a brand new set of standards to add to all the standards that are already out there. Rather than creating something new, we wanted to streamline and harmonize existing standards and potentially make it even easier for projects to follow standards. As Elizabeth said, it's all quite confusing, all the standards that are out there, and how do you figure out which one to follow? With Bluedot Network, we hope you can projects can mark themselves against one comprehensive set of standards in one go, rather than looking through all the disparate ones out there, trying to figure out which ones you need to mark against and how to do so. Jennifer mentioned climate at the top, so this is probably a good place to mention that climate is one of the areas that we've added to Bluedot since the Biden administration came into office. When the administration came into office last year, they reviewed Bluedot Network, agreed the initiative advanced their goals as well, even though it was initiatives from the previous administration. They had only one request, which was to add in a climate element, and we have worked with the OECD to develop some metrics to measure that. So our OECD colleagues examined all the infrastructure standards out there, mapped them against the 10 Bluedot network elements. You would probably recognize all the standards and principles they used, including those from the G20, as we mentioned earlier, the IFC's performance standards, the Equator principles, the OECD's own guidelines as well, and also industry standards and their own best practices. This slide here has those 10 elements, which might be too much to read right here, but you can see them in the OECD's report and also on our BDN website. If you look in the middle there, a big part of the criteria will be the environment, social, and governance, or the ESG elements. Those are derived primarily from IFC performance standards. But the advice from our advisory group was that quality infrastructure goes beyond these ESG elements. They're obviously very important, but there's more to it. So we're incorporating standards for climate, anti-corruption, transparency, debt sustainability, local skills transfer, etc., all of which are critical for making sure that infrastructure really delivers benefits to communities. I want to mention as well that throughout this whole process, and this slide here tells a bit about how the OECD proceeded with their report, we've been consulting very closely with key stakeholders. One of the first things we did when we started designing Bluedot Network was to organize an advisory group, the Bluedot Network Executive Consultation Group, which is made up now of over 190 representatives from businesses involved in infrastructure, including construction companies and financiers, but also from academia and civil society. Their input was really key to getting us started on the right track and understanding all the challenges, and also just giving us a reality check on the options we were looking at to make sure they were going to work correctly. So how Bluedot will work in practice will be that projects, and BDN is focused at the project level. Projects that see a benefit in having BDN certification would apply early in the project implementation phase before financing is closed, with the aim of attracting private sector investment at that point. So the project would first do a self-assessment to see if they would actually qualify for a Blue Dot before they go through the whole process. And if so, we'd follow up with an independent review. The OECD developed a list of documents and data that we'll request from projects, ones that any quality project would have handy and shouldn't be too difficult to present. As part of Blue Dot, we won't need new data or reports just to get Blue Dot Network certification. In the interest of time, I'll skip a lot of the details on how it'll work, but you can read more in the OECD's report on its website. So the next steps for us are to test out the certification methodology with some pilot projects, as FAST-Infra is doing. We're currently preparing to assess about a dozen projects worldwide. The projects are across the whole spectrum: transport, digital, renewable energy, water, sanitation, and health, and in all different parts of the world. We are not planning to officially certify the pilot projects at this point, but of course, they would be the most likely candidates for certification once we're fully operational, having already gone through the whole process. So the pilot process, our goal is to help us refine the certification process to ensure that it's credible without being overly burdensome. And we want to be sure that the process works, that a project certified by BDN would be recognized as a genuinely quality project. At the same time, we want it to be achievable. We don't want the bar to be so high that projects in emerging markets just wouldn't see that they would have a chance to become certified. In the end, BDN is about quality projects, but it isn't about which project spent the most money or had the highest price consultants. It's just about following the right processes that any project, big or small, in the richest countries to the poorest, should be able to follow. Let me just take down the PowerPoint here. I don't think we need to keep that up. But as part of our next phase of work, we're also developing mutual recognition arrangements so that we can recognize the work done via similar processes or assessment frameworks, whether that's part of the multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, including our own, or similar initiatives like FAST-Infra. So in this way, if a project has already gone through an assessment process that matches well with Bluedot Network, we wouldn't have to repeat those areas that overlap as part of the BDN assessment, which would make the whole process much easier and much quicker. One of the good things about all the initiatives we've heard about today, but I think we all have very similar goals. Seems like we all agree on the need for more and better infrastructure better processes for how to get us there. We just have some different approaches, but the infrastructure world is a big place. I think there's room for a lot of different work. We see a situation where projects could potentially choose to have Bluedot network certification and a FAST-Infra label, and we'd make that as easy as possible to do that, or they could choose which one fits their needs best. We just want to be sure that our initiatives and our work with the MDBs and the DFIs are all complementary, that we're working together and that we're not at cross purposes or duplicating efforts here. I'll close this up by listing one other area we'll be looking at going forward, which is what kind of capacity building needs are out there. We are aware we're creating a system that can certify whether a project has met standards, but without having anything in place to help countries to meet those standards. As part of the BDN pilot process and the work we'll do once we're fully operational, we know we're going to find more capacity issues out there, some on the micro level. Projects need help to make it through the BDN process, or on a more macro level for projects or sectors or countries on how to meet standards in general. One example we're working on right now is a project that the State Department and the OECD are working on together. We're creating an infrastructure anti-corruption toolkit, or IACT, which will help build capacity of stakeholders to put in place effective transparency and anti-corruption systems and policies across the whole life cycle of the infrastructure development, including corruption prevention, corruption detection frameworks, with the goal to meet the requirements of global programs for infrastructure investment, like Bluedot Network. So this could be a model for how we approach further capacity building efforts. And I think I've hit my limit here and gone over. So thanks for listening today. I will pass it back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And thank the audience. The questions are starting to pour in. Keep bringing them in. Actually, one of the last things you were saying, Peter, and I think because this guy, Bart and Edis, he had a question, and the last part kind of relates also to Carmel, says, BDN was initially pushed by the USA, Japan, and Australia. To what extent are Canada and the other G7 countries directly involved in managing the initiative? Will they be closely engaged in the period ahead? And now this is kind of a bridging question. How does BDN relate to SI, as described by Carmel? Because you had mentioned the thing about how you were going to try to mutual recognition process. I mean, it does take two to tango. So I was kind of curious about not making a competition, but also same thing, throwing it to you too as well, Christoph. I mean, are the Chinese just doing their thing? Or I love the idea about the mutual recognition process. So maybe just start us off quickly there, Peter. If
Sure.
those questions make sense.
Sure, to Bart's question there. Hi, Bart. So how we're working with Canada and other G7 members, we have been keeping them all up to date. We've had regular conversations with them, both bilaterally and within the OECD structure as well. At this point, we have talked to the G7 about Bluedot Network, also, as you mentioned, through PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is kind of our umbrella, and Bluedot Network will be a part of that. But at this point, we're still putting it all together, but we are hoping that once we get closer to being operational, that we'll be able to open it up for membership to other countries and they can join in. But we are still, asking for input from other countries, getting their advice on how we can make this process as useful and usable as possible. To the second question on how we're working with like FAST-Infra, like you said, takes two to tango. Well, I think everything we have had we've had several discussions with our FAST-Infra colleagues, both in DC and in Paris. And I think we're both pretty open about what our processes are going to be, what the standards are. We've taken a look through and mapped out how much overlap there is between FAST-Infra and Bluedot Network. I'm sure we'll continue to refine this as we refine our own process, but I think we're fairly familiar with each other's processes and what the metrics that we'll have. And I think it'll be something we'll need to work on, but it won't be too difficult a situation to figure out where the overlap is. I think FAST-Infra, as Carmel mentioned, it's based a lot on IFC performance standards, which is Bluedot Network is based a lot on that as well. So we'll have a very similar approach in the ESG areas. So I think it'll be relatively I say that now. It's going to be, not complex. I'm sure it will be, but we'll be working on that.
Well, also to interject before you talk, Carmel, that one of the last things Elizabeth asked was whether or not these different systems are going to compete or reinforce, and by the competition, is it going to confuse the markets? And can you comment on kind of what Elizabeth said?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry, go for it.
Go ahead, Carmel. That was for you.
Oh, no. I mean, all that to say, no, I don't, the idea is certainly not to compete. All of these frameworks are meant to reinforce. And I think, as Peter already mentioned, it's clear where the overlaps are in these various frameworks. And it's also clear where each framework or kind of standard complements each other. And again, I think that this process of mutual recognition will be very important as these labels get operationalized, and kind of even building out or like very explicitly defining what that process looks like on our respective websites or somewhere. So it's very clear saying, okay, you've met, now you've gone through the BDM process, or you've gone through the SI label self-declaration. This is exactly like what you will need or need to do or demonstrate in order to kind of achieve both. And again, it's not meant to create an additional layer, but there are clearly areas of the 10 elements of BDN. The SI label doesn't cover all of those portions, and so it would make sense that there would need to be some sort of process that's clearly laid out. So we've continued these discussions, and I think it's very clear that they're meant to mutually reinforce. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there.
Thanks. And Christoph, for the Chinese, the guidance, the green guidance, are they playing in their own sandbox, or that you said you did say that they did base this on international practices?
Right. Kind of the genesis of the green development guidance is, of course, based on international standards. It's similar to, I think, the others. We didn't try to kind of recreate anything in a sense, but bring everything together and make it relevant for the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, again, the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is much more top-down. There's a lot of state-owned enterprises, state-owned financial institutions, policy banks involved, and this is the target group in many ways for the green development guidance and the traffic light system. So in many ways, the processes, I think, are very much aligned with the Bluedot network or the FAST-Infra, but the application, I think, is in some ways different. In a sense, ideally, the green development guidance has more teeth. It is more top-down, and so it is expected that the different developers and financial institutions and insurance, Sinosure, will take in parts of it, which we're already seeing in the regulation. And so I think there's much more top-down oversight. It's not as it's voluntary, but voluntary ideally with some more teeth compared to the other ones in a Chinese characteristics way.
Okay, and flagging, I think that we got a question from Arun Satar at Tufts, which I think kind of was maybe the questioner got the idea of, because when Peter, when you were talking, you mentioned how BDN wants to have some capacity building mechanisms in there. And so Arun asks you, Christoph, about whether there are any efforts to raise standards in the countries receiving the investments, as obviously that's been a weak link. And is there ways will the Chinese be trying to help kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, but like to help them kind of, will you be helping the host countries kind of help meet the standards and also help them to raise their own ability to meet these green standards? Is that
right? So I think there is both the Belt and Road Initiative Green Development Coalitions, or the BRI, has 50% of its members are from all types of countries. The green development guidance itself was developed together with Mongolia and Pakistan and Indonesian stakeholders. So we have a lot of stakeholder involvement throughout the development process. It is also kind of the idea in developing this was also to help host countries of these investments, BRI countries, to say, listen, this is a green project. We want green projects. We don't want the red projects anymore. We want green projects. Here, you have told us that this is a green project, and you don't want those anymore. So make sure that we get those projects. So it's in this sense kind of a relatively easy pick and choose taxonomy that can be applied in host countries. There is a number of kind of not only the green development guidance, but overall the Chinese are of course engaged across the board in terms of capacity building in a lot of the countries, also for the Green Finance Leadership Program, which is kind of reaching out, and the Green Investment Principles, which has now offices at least in Kazakhstan, and I think they're opening one or two more. So there's a lot of capacity building in this greening the BRI world going on in the BRI countries, which is kind of all entangled in this kind of the green development guidance and green BRI and broader aspects of that.
Okay, thank you. And Elizabeth, one of your colleagues at Duke asked a question, and maybe you can kind of chime in. But Jonathan Phillips, director of the Energy Access Project at Duke, asks, we covered how these labels and standards focus attention of the financiers on quality projects. How do they connect to local governments, like permitting, co-financing, et cetera? And complementary tools like the MDBs, DFIs, PRG currencies. We got this alphabet soup. So, okay, sorry. So let me, so first of all, the question on how do they connect with local governments, and complementary tools like MBDs needed to mobilize payments, mobilize private money, and accelerate project timelines. Sorry, do I need to reread it, Elizabeth?
No. It's a great question. I think at some level, some of that has been answered already, but I'll repeat in part what Christoph just mentioned a moment ago, that at some level, this should be helping these local governments, but that's a little bit optimistic to assume that there isn't pressure to get perhaps some of these projects, which might have some strong backer and a high level of government, that wants a project that isn't green for whatever political, financial, whatever reason there is. So working with the governments is critical. And I think Peter talked about some of the efforts and the fact that there are 3 governments that are associated with some of the acronyms that Jonathan mentioned, like DFC, the Development Finance Corporation of the US, or say USAID perhaps, and others. And with each of the countries, that gives them the opportunity to do a 1-2 punch, because ultimately this is just these are just meta standards. These aren't policies, these aren't programs, these are standards, but they need to accompany technical assistance and capacity development. If they don't, one could imagine a world that these standards are accepted and a lot of money from these institutional funds that we discussed, private sector money, begins to flow and follow those different projects that are classified. And in this case, I'm really talking about FAST-Infra and Bluedot more so than the Green Development Guidance, although it could also fit this. And you could imagine countries that already have the capacity to quickly certify or classify get a label, because they already have all the tools at their disposal. They already have all the data. They already have the contracting companies available. They'll be able to grab that money much faster than, say, a developing country, that it's a real stretch. And so it's not just making this available, but you got to help some of these countries that need assistance, not just labeling, but actually the whole process. And I think Peter said that more or less, but I just want to emphasize that is fundamental to making this work.
Elizabeth, do you have a question for any of the other panelists?
I do, and it has to do with the review process, which was briefly mentioned in all 3. But external review is one way of helping protect a project against the threat of greenwashing because if you can just say self-certify or self-declare that you are green or sustainable or quality without some external source, whether you are or not, there may be the perception that that is not true, but it also creates a barrier. So I'm wondering, I know there are differences between these. I'm wondering, first of all, how important it is to each of these standards that you require it versus just recommend it. And also, if there is mutual recognition, what do you do if one of these meta standards requires external review and the other just recommends it?
Carmel, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to start, and then I can pass it over to Peter. I think it's a good question, and I can give just the process currently envisioned by the SI label. So as part of our declaration process, I said several times, you can self-declare. And so what that means in the framework, and it's articulated as such, is that external review is highly encouraged, but not required. And this follows kind of the guidance that we had in speaking to the International Capital Markets Association and their approach to doing this with the green bond principles. However, what they say is that given the transparent disclosure that is very fundamental to the SI label, it creates kind of this natural checks and balances in a way that you can self-declare, but you need to transparently show how you're meeting the label, and there will be some sort of due diligence that's done by the Secretariat in processing that data to be put on the platform, where they may come back with questions. Again, we see that there will be kind of a natural incentive towards doing external review. So we imagine that most will pursue this route. But to your point on the portion that we also don't want to create any sort of cost prohibitive consideration, especially to smaller projects, perhaps, that where such a price tag might disincentivize them from wanting to at least go through the process. That said, the Secretariat that will soon be announced will be providing tools and resources, and we'll try to also develop their own roster of verifiers that can kind of serve as this resource to, again, encourage external review. Since we certainly, when we say we highly encourage, we really mean that, and we expect that most will take that on. But in terms of how that aligns to BDN and others, and I'll let Peter speak to that, I think we'll try to find the right way to kind of weight what is most fundamental towards meeting each label to ensure that if somebody chooses to self-declare and not go through the process, just kind of consulting and seeing what that would mean for meeting the other standards. So that's, I think, an ongoing negotiation that we're also wrestling with as well. But hopefully we'll have more clarity on soon. But let me pass it over to Peter.
Sure. I think we have a similar mindset on that too. We also early in the process looked at whether we could simply do a self-assessment, which would of course make things a lot easier and cheaper. And we ran that through our advisory group, and their advice was, they really wanted to see something, an independent review, not even just by us, but by someone outside of the system, to make sure it wasn't not just that it was not self-labeling, but that there wasn't any political part to how we were looking at projects. We wanted to keep an arm's length away from the governments. But that was something that was considered to be quite critical in how we're going to do this. Now, how we work with recognizing a project that was self-declaring. Well, as Carmel said, the data will be up on the website. It might be a little easier if a project was actually certified or reviewed independently. That'd be a lot easier for us to work with, be easier to confirm. But we might be able to do it just by running through the documents that are up there. Kind of an open question is how much the data will be, even for our own. We know we'd like to put as much up on a website as possible, so investors can see what the results were. But of course, there's going to be a lot of information that will be business confidential that we'll have to keep offline. So, having that certification process will help show that we've gone through the process without having to give away a lot of the data. But well, you know, you found the right issue there. This is something we'll have to work out between the systems, and that goes not just for FAST-Infra, but you know, the work we do with the MDBs and DFIs and so on.
And Christoph, a number of people have sprinkled in also, you know, talking about the guidance and the traffic light systems, wondering about how it will be audited, third-party verification, and, you know, just overall the transparency, because you and I, we all know BRI projects have been anything but transparent. Sometimes you don't even know what the list is. So where does the guidance document kind of come out on more transparency and verification issues?
Right. I think to that point, and I raised a point in my presentation. I think the logic that also in many ways equator principles also follow is that if you have a high-risk project, you should have more stringent transparency, more stringent oversight, more stringent independent oversight. Whereas if you have a low-risk project that is clearly kind of ideally green, and it is clearly not in a key biodiversity area and does not, of course, also has social benefits ideally, then the oversight and the independent oversight needs to be, or can be, more relaxed. And I think this is a core of the recommendations. It has been of the equator principle, so it's also not reinventing the wheel. I mean, the core principle of a lot of the financial risk management, that if you have higher risk projects, there must be more oversight. If you have lower risk projects, you have to have less oversight. And I think that's an interesting, again, I think not the right step in terms of when we talk about green financing, greening, that we put more burden on greener projects, and kind of the dirty projects, if you don't want an SI label, fine, you don't have to have oversight. So I think we kind of really have to kind of move in the other direction. We have to get away from the dirty stuff. We have to make the dirty stuff more complicated and not the green stuff more complicated. And so in terms of oversight, independent oversight for BRI projects, there has been significant progress over the last 2 years to include at least the recommendation for independent oversight in official overseas investment guidelines. So not only the traffic light system, but the green development guidance, which is kind of the baseline study that informs ideally policymakers, and has then led to the coal exit. It has also led to the inclusion of independent oversight of projects along the whole process lifecycle. So from planning to construction to management, and then through decommissioning. So that's really progress that we have been seeing for both the financial institutions and for the developers. So it's much more regulatory driven than than this voluntary driven. But it's a different system. We need top-down guidelines much more in China. It's just the way the system works.
And I want to kind of modify a question that came in from Alex Runicki from JD.com, was asking about, you know, how solar power has become cheaper in China as it has globally. And he was kind of curious about if, you know, not just with the cost, he asked about the cost issues making it easier to get China's solar onto the Belt and Road. But my question is, do you see, like, because solar panel companies in China have sometimes had difficulty getting on the Belt and Road, because they're private companies, a lot of them. Do you think that with these new standards, will it make it easier for them to get their projects out there and get them approved?
Thanks, Alex, for the question, and thanks also for modifying that. So it's interesting. The project finance mechanism for renewable energies like solar and wind are extremely different from the large infrastructure in coal, hydropower, and gas. We have not the typical build, own, operate, transfer models, but much more what is called FT model, finance and transfer models, that have different financing structures, that have different ownership structures. And so what we have seen, that a lot of the solar kind of supplies from China have been actually foreign financed. They don't need Chinese financing. It's kind of 75–80% of all the global solar panels are coming from China. So when the World Bank does investments with solar, when the EBRD does investments with solar, it's most likely that it's supplied by Chinese companies. So it's not that these companies are dependent on Chinese financing. What we hope to see, though, is that Chinese investors will invest much more in solar, what they did previously in fossil fuels, in particular coal, that it will shift to renewable energy. And China just yesterday announced a new global energy development partnership or something like, I think that's what it's called, in order to harness its own manufacturing potential, financing potential to support particularly African countries. I think that's the focus right now on the green transition.
And I'll ask one more question about a specific kind of energy infrastructure. My colleague Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center, he asked about, there's the race for rare earths in the world. And he was kind of wondering, with these kind of meta systems that we're talking about, how will this green infrastructure kind of focus on the challenges of the rare earths, which often are very kind of, dirty mining processes, human rights challenges. And also similarly, he asked when he hits 10 minutes later, asked about, and what about nuclear power, nuclear waste issues? So like, where does you like Bluedot network, or, where do you guys maybe come down on those kinds of energy infrastructure type challenges?
Who should?
Peter? Peter?
Was that to me thing?
Yeah, just all of you for your respective.
Yeah, just on where we come down on energy issues. Yeah.
Well, on the issue, like there's the rare earth mining, there's nuclear waste. So really just focusing in on not building a pretty, renewable, farm, but look at, kind of the dirty side of stuff. I mean, is that it's within your standards apply to these? And do you just want to get a little sense of how?
Yes, but at least for Bluedot Network, as I mentioned, there is a climate component to this. So projects would have to show that they're being built to be resilient to climate change and aligned with the Paris Agreement and our goal for net zero emissions by 2050. So it would be very difficult for us to certify a coal-fired power plant or some other operation like that. It would just be very difficult for them to pass it. So I think most of the energy might come down on the renewable side, but not exclusively.
But what about the lithium and the dirty metals that are needed for renewable technologies?
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, and the whole supply chain that comes with it. That's a very good question. I don't have a great answer to that.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. But again, putting out the questions, maybe Carmel kind of pinging it over to you, because I mean, private sector investment supports some of this stuff.
Yeah, certainly. And this question came up a lot, especially during our, we also similarly had like a public consultation period with members of the private sector, with multilaterals, with governments, and in finalizing our framework. And, I mean, a key question that came out was, yes, how about these projects that are, coal-fired, or energy storage is maybe not super sustainable, or nuclear power? And I mean, similar to Peter, we're not excluding any asset. Like, we do have an indicative list of assets as part of our framework, just as good guidance, but it's an inexhaustive list. So there can certainly be other projects outside of that. But again, I think it would come down to the specifications of the project itself and the operating environment. But it would be very hard to meet especially on the environment dimension. The baseline that we have is already quite high, and so it's not impossible. But we also include as part of the minimum safeguards, plans to phase out coal, or like other things that can be included, saying how you intend to achieve that. But again, the barrier to entry is already there, so it's difficult but not impossible, I would say.
And maybe since Elizabeth, since you started us out and you laid out the roadmap, can you make some final comments, or maybe toss one last quick question to your colleagues from what you've heard today?
Sure, I'll just make a final comment, bringing it back to this as part of the China Environment Forum. So sort of bring it back to that. It's really encouraging to hear how the goals of these three initiatives really are closely aligned. And it seems at this moment when, say, the US and China have largely stopped talking and coordinating on climate and other sort of related environmental areas, that this is a simple way, just a tiny sort of foot in the door, if there could be further discussions, maybe brought by a third party, the G20 and their QII principles, bringing together to really try to make it a race to the top and really make this something where there is acknowledgement of this suite, and they do reinforce and perhaps maybe even help move forward some and help kind of jumpstart some of the conversations again between the US and China and the West more broadly. So I don't know, maybe some of the other panelists have some thoughts on that, but that's my dream.
Well, actually, so Christoph, so with in the work that you're doing in China, I know, I mean, I'm convinced that, you know, that some of the US based NGOs and US researchers have probably also been involved in some of the conversations and the developments over the years on, you know, greening BRI, and creating this guidance wasn't just an overnight event.
Right. So definitely, I think WRI has been leading a lot of the efforts, World Resources Institute, Energy Foundation. So a lot of the American NGOs are, of course, very active in China, particularly also both on the domestic but also international green transition. So it's definitely, I think the goal is to align standards and not they might at least harmonize them. I don't think they will be necessarily mutually equal, but at least harmonized, because I think that's extremely important to close the infrastructure gap that we mentioned before. It cannot be done by China. Ideally, financial institutions want to work together and invest in projects that they trust have lower risks for environment, so the social risk, and then of course governance risks.
And so and just real quickly I know that Carmel, that you mentioned that at the COP that FAST-Infra is going to be rolling out with who's your secretariat and some other good things. And I assume will Bluedot network be there as well at the COP, the climate COP?
We're looking at doing something at the COP, but I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about you, Christoph? I mean, the Chinese Xi Jinping has even just said in some of his recent comments that China's a leader on green climate, green infrastructure. What are you guys going to be involved in anything at the COP?
So I will have to be in Shanghai to teach, but some of the colleagues from the MEE, from Ministry of Ecology and Environment, and some of our partners like Client Earth and WRI will all be there to share progress, and of course also see what next steps we can take.
Well, it's good that things will be in person. Hopefully there'll be some good hallway chats among all these different mega standard groups. So I want to thank all four of you for coming today to have a conversation, kind of particularly, you know, starting off Elizabeth kind of laying the landscape well. That was super helpful. I think I can tell the story better later, but I want to thank everyone here for tuning in for us today. Let you know too that we have another meeting next week on the 27th. That is going to be bringing our friend Ma Jun from IPE and a couple other speakers to talk about rivers and climate resilience. So in China, Europe, and Middle East. So come tune in then. And also want to thank the Luce Foundation for their support for my project now these days, and as well as Environmental Change Security Program and Asia Program for co-sponsoring. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.